Earlier today, I shot my first IDPA match in nearly a year, and it made me think about why IDPA gets so much hate as a sport and whether or not it's actually deserved. So today, we're gonna talk about just that. My goal here is to try to be as objective as possible, although I am biased, and I'm going to lay out all the negatives along with all the positives of IDPA as a shooting sport, and then I will leave it to you to decide what you think for yourself. As a useful bit of context, I am no outsider to IDPA. I've shot roughly 40 or 50 matches over the last 3 years in IDPA alone, and I'm currently a masterclass carry optics shooter. Before I start playing devil's advocate and defending this sport, I want to talk about all of the negative things, all of the very valid complaints that people will bring up about IDPA. You'll mainly hear these from USPSA shooters, but you might also hear them from people who shot, a couple IDPA matches. It was the only sport they shot and they were like, what on earth is this? I'm never doing it again. The general theme with the negative points is going to be the fact that IDPA, in the pursuit of some form of realism, is going to place a lot of procedural rules on top of the raw test of shooting performance that we wish it would be. I'm not trying to be nitpicky here. Every sport has its quirks, so I'm really just gonna touch on the key points I think that most people will have a problem with when it comes to this sport. The first problem I'd like to discuss with IDPA is probably the epitome of procedural rule gimmicks, and it is the way that IDPA forces you to manage your ammo. In the rulebook, IDPA specifically says that emergency slide lock reloads are what is preferred. Yes, that is what they say word for word. Yes, multiple people approved that statement in the rulebook. For those of you that don't know, IDPA stands for the International Defensive Pistol Association, and the entire premise of the sport is that it's supposed to, quote unquote, test how you would perform with your carry gear in a defensive situation. And it just really boggles me that in a sport that really centers itself around, these hypothetical defensive scenarios, we're going to encourage people to go to slide lock in the middle of a target array. There's really no way to explain this without any sort of mental gymnastics and try to make it make sense. Maybe you can for me in the comments. I'm sure someone would love to argue with you. Not only do they prefer that you do slide lock reloads, but they will actually issue you a whopping 3-second penalty for any time you perform a reload and drop a magazine that still has ammo in it and you leave it. So that means if you were to be running from one position to another and you perform a reload and you've got a partial mag that you drop on the ground, you have to pick that up or stow it on your person without dropping it as you're performing the reload. This is super silly to me because it's gonna add roughly, even if you're fast, a second to the reload process. What does this mean for shooters? So if you're shooting IDPA and you have a partial magazine, you have one of two options. You can either arbitrarily dump extra rounds downrange, either at the berm or at targets. Both options sound terrible, especially from a defensive standpoint, right? Or you can perform a reload that is significantly slower and stow that magazine in a pocket, in your jacket, or anywhere else on your person, right? So none of this makes sense. If you were running from point A to point B and you wanted to top off your gun, it would make complete sense for you to just drop a partial magazine and top off your gun. The next point you'll see people bring up against IDPA is that the stage boundaries are actually marked using fault lines on the edges of walls rather than some sort of enclosed boundary, similar to how USPSA, PCSL, and IPSC do it, where it's almost like a video game map and it's a closed shape and you know where to move from. No, none of that exists in IDPA. You have a relatively open area and then there will typically be walls on nearly every stage or something that you're gonna, lean out from. And there will be a fault line on the ground to mark where your feet can be as you lean out from a position of cover. And if you were to step over that and, go too far, then you'd be killed in the streets and you'd get another 3-second penalty for stepping over that fault line. My issue, frankly, isn't with the fact that they're doing this fault line thing and forcing you to slice the pie. We can talk more about that another time. But the real issue is this causes a lot of confusion on certain stages, and it's just not a level of confusion that you see with the other sports that use some sort of enclosed shape for their stage briefing. Now, you might be a veteran IDPA shooter and saying, well, you just don't get it. You're a dumb kid, and how do you not understand the fault lines? And it's like, I've shot a lot of IDPA matches. Many stages do make sense with the fault lines, but others end up becoming debates with the range officers about, well, there's a fault line on the left side, but not on the right side. What if I just ran around this, structure that you've created and then like take the targets from this? And the stage designer didn't make it that way with that intent. So they'll get all mad that you found some sort of loophole and everything falls apart. The third point that you'll see people bring up against IDPA is the weird like props that you'll see in certain stages. And I'll probably just put some video footage up here so you can see what I'm talking about. But some examples that I personally experienced were like a fishing rod that you had to like start the stage with in your hands, and you like whipped it up and that would activate some sort of target. Stuff like that is just silly. And the problem is that these props aren't just, props that happen to exist in the competition. They often trigger moving targets, and if they ever behave inconsistently, it threatens the fairness of the competition. That's what I'm really getting at. So these gimmicky props that are meant to, feel like real life or whatever is going on can not only be silly, but they're also going to probably hurt the fairness of the competition unless they're done really, really well. Okay, I'm tired of being negative, but my final point against IDPA, and this is probably the biggest one I've got, is the scoring system. IDPA uses a scoring system called Time Plus, where your score is made up of the raw time that it took you to shoot the stage, and then you're assigned time penalties for any of the procedural stuff that we talked about beforehand, or anything other than imperfect, or anything other than perfect accuracy. If you want to jump into the math, we already did a video on that. It's called, why hit factor is the best thing ever. You should definitely watch that if you want to nerd out on how to measure your shooting performance. Okay, now that we've laid out the biggest pain points that people will bring up with IDPA, let's talk about some of the positive things. Now, I want to start off strong and talk about the greatest thing I appreciate about IDPA, and it is that basic premise of getting you to perform on demand with your everyday carry gear. While it is legal to use your everyday carry setups in other sports, you're probably going to be at a disadvantage, albeit a minor one, but still a disadvantage. So if you're truly trying to be competitive and want to be on a level playing field while still doing a lot of your stuff from concealment, IDPA is the place to do it. And it's because of that context of wanting to perform with your everyday carry gear. Yes, a lot of veteran IDPA shooters are still going to have, outside the waistband holsters and their silly fishing vests. I'll put some photos up so you can see. But since they legalized appendix carry rigs in 2022, a lot of the skilled shooters have been switching over to appendix carry setups, and we're starting to see that become the meta setup more and more. My second defense of IDPA involves a little bit of mental gymnastics, but I think you're gonna pick up what I'm putting down. Because of all these procedural rules, I think you could make the argument that IDPA kind of challenges you to really, really nail down your subconscious shooting, because you've got to remember all of these different procedural rules, almost like a game of Simon Says, and your conscious brain is going to be occupied with a lot of that rather than the shooting itself. So you could maybe make the argument that you're going to be dealing with a lot of mental problems besides the shooting, and you're really going to see what your raw shooting is going to be like as you're trying to think about your partial magazines and all the other silly stuff going on. So take that with a grain of salt. I'm not necessarily married to that idea, but that was one piece of food for thought that I came up with. Okay, and my final point to defend IDPA, wow, I can't believe I'm doing this on video, is that the silly props I mentioned and the ludicrous scenario stories that you're briefed with for every stage, yes, they're silly, they can be cringe at times, but frankly, it can make it fun if you decide to not take it too seriously. And that's exactly what I do when I shoot IDPA at this point. I go in there, I show up with my carry gun, and I shoot the best I can. I have fun with people, and frankly, that is what it's all about. If you're going to a match and you're, super, I'm gonna do so well, blah, 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 IDPA is not the sport for you. Shoot USPSA, do that, test your performance. Sometimes it's fun to just enter a competition where I'm not too concerned about the result, and IDPA provides that environment. So, despite all of the silly procedural stuff that I mentioned and the inferior scoring system and blah, 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 we're shooting guns, and there's still fun to be had. All right, we've laid out several points both for and against IDPA as a practical shooting sport. Now here's my final thoughts. Are the procedural rules annoying? Yes. Is time plus scoring objectively worse than hit factor? Absolutely. If IDPA is the only practical shooting sport that you have access to, you're never going to catch me saying that you shouldn't participate in it. You'll still be testing your performance on demand, competing with your everyday carry gear, and you're probably going to meet some great people in the process. So go shoot the sport if you don't have access to USPSA, PCSL, or IPSC. Now that I've done all this talking, I'd love to hear your opinion in the comments. I promise there's someone with enough free time to argue with you. There always is. Thank you for watching, and I hope this video made you a better marksman.